Let's kick it off. Guys, very excited to be here. My name is Henry Arslanian. Really, my passion and my focus in life is the future of the financial service industry. And I'm just very lucky I do this at PwC, where I lead our fintech and crypto practice in Asia. Today, we're going to talk about a very relevant topic, whether about coordination between government bodies and regulators, whether it's possible or not, and what are the pitfalls that we're seeing, and especially some of the developments we've seen in the last couple of days with some of the regulatory bodies globally. I cannot guarantee we're going to solve all the problems of global coordination today, but I promise you it's going to be interesting, it's going to be insightful, and most importantly, it's going to be exciting. And to do this, we have today the Dream Team panel to talk about some of these topics today. I'll start on the far right. We have Peter Zilgavis, who's the head of Unit for Digital Innovation and Blockchain in the Digital Single Market Directorate in DG Connect in the EU. That's a hell of a title. And who's also the co-chair of the European Commission FinTech Task Force. By the way, one thing about Peter is people don't know. He was at UCLA and USC's surfing teams. Oh. And he surfed in Europe, California, Mexico, Hawaii, the US East Coast, and Africa. So hey, you thought regulators were not fun? Great example from that perspective.
Still the future for me.
And then we have also Greg Metcalf. He has a 30-year career in investment banking, where he finished as the global head of securitization at SocGen before moving on the regulatory side, where he was a chair of ASIC in Australia, the chair of IOSCO, great organization, and also he's now the OECD's director for financial enterprise affairs, where he leads the organization's work supporting fair and efficient markets and is responsible for the OECD's Blockchain Policy Center that we'll talk about today. By the way, one thing about Greg people don't know, he was elected as mayor in both Melbourne and Sydney as an independent candidate. So here you go, a great example of the banker becoming regulator, becoming politician. I think the only thing you miss is being a professional sports player, and you'll cover it off. So let's kick it off, guys. I mean, before we start, you know, what I find very interesting with both the EC and OECD, people in the community don't know what you guys are doing. I mean, no offense, but people often don't know what you guys are doing in blockchain crypto. Can you maybe give a quick overview of what are you guys doing in this space? And then we'll jump into some of the questions. Maybe we'll start with you, Greg, and we'll move on from there.
Sure. Well, look, thanks, Henry, for that great introduction. You've got to come to Australia and surf.
Anyway. I will. Thanks for the invitation.
And in Sydney or Melbourne.
Excellent.
Look, as you know, I think we've heard at the conference, the uses of blockchain have surged over the last few years for public and private institutions alike, right? Talking about for a number of years. And I think what we do at the OECD is we advise governments on policy either for their own use or for regulating institutions. That's what we do. So, and when we look at blockchain, we think that the role of international organisations like ours, and indeed any policymaker, is not to pick on any technology, but to ensure that policy regulation doesn't unduly hinder innovation. That's certainly my philosophy, and I think it is that of many others. So to that end, I think the role of international organisations, really, if you're running something like OECD, it's about really three objectives. One is being proactive and forward-looking. Secondly, providing a forum for what we do in terms of policy research, okay? Standard setting, capacity building, partnerships with business and with others, and then finally facilitating an international coordinated policy approach. So if I just unpack these briefly, this sort of tells you about what we're doing anyway, right? So in terms of being proactive and forward-looking, that's really important that you don't get a knee-jerk reaction on a policy perspective and resist the temptation to properly, to jump in before you actually understand, and we'll probably talk about that a bit later on. So despite its enormous potential, the ultimate impact of blockchain will depend, and this is important, on the ability of government to develop the right policies to harness the potential benefits while mitigating the risks for potential misuse, and I know you have an example in mind on that one. But also what we've also need, I think is very important, is that we have a regulatory level playing field, and you do need some level of proportionality that's warranted for innovative startups to thrive and to thrive and compete. And I think that's very important if we're going to deliver blockchain's potential benefits to consumers and to business. So, but what's most important is to keep regulators up to date in terms of the blockchain application. So And this takes me on to my second point, which is about, regulators having a forum for policy research, which is really what OECD does: policy research, standard setting, capacity building, convening and partnerships. So on policy research and analysis, IOs do provide analysis and research to assist governments. So at the OECD, we're already looking at blockchain implications and applications for blockchain across all the directorates of the OECD, some more than others. So, for example, we've been doing policy research on tracing inputs into global value chains, for example, in the footwear and the textile sectors, in the food sector, in the mineral supply chains, using distributed ledger, working with industry. We're looking at policies in terms of facilitating better access to finance for SMEs. We've done a lot of work on ICOs, for example, policy development. A lot of work on combating tax avoidance and evasion using distributed ledger as another example. We've got documentation on this on our website at OECD. We've also been looking at blockchain unchained for business and looking at things like digital titling and land registries, but also helping citizens look at identity, and also looking at in the transport sector. So we've been looking at in a lot of areas in terms of research. So that's the first step of anything in policy development. The second thing is in standard setting. At the moment, one of the things that is lacking is an overall standard blockchain policy infrastructure. And it is something we do envisage in the future, hopefully working with the European Union, because I do think if you're going to have correct development, then you need an overall global framework. Okay? And then the other thing we do in capacity building at the OECD is we often help governments, say in the blockchain area, if they're looking at, say, regulating crypto assets or whatever, we will provide them with advice. Also, we do a fair bit of training inside of government because just explaining the difference between blockchain and Bitcoin, a bit of an issue still. On convening, we bring together policymakers. So our blockchain policy forum last September had 1,200 participants, 20,000 participating online. We're going to do that again September this year. And we also lead the Financial Stability Board Task Force on distributed ledger. So we do a lot of convening, bringing better people to discuss the topics, both policymakers and business. And then finally, in partnerships, again, we bring together business and policymakers to look at what we should do. So that's what we do. And then finally, on the third thing I said, coordinated international response. Given the global nature of markets, it's important we get connected and we make sure we avoid regulatory fragmentation. We curb the incentives for regulatory arbitrage and we spread practices. And the key to that is actually global standards and making sure that basically international organisations, they're harmonised. And already we're working OECD with things like the International Organisation of Securities Commissions. We're looking at tokens. We're working with the International Organisation of Standardisation, ISO, on terms of standards, industry standards. So I think it is transformative. It's important that international organisations help governments develop the right policy environment so innovation can flourish, but coordination is critical. So, that's what we're doing.
We'll talk about that, especially with the link with FATF as well. I'm sure there's a lot of interest from that. We'll come back in a second. Maybe on your side, Peter, can you give us also an overview of what the EC is doing, the European Commission, and your team when it comes to crypto and blockchain?
Exactly. I mean, as part of supporting the digital transformation, that's artificial intelligence, high-performance computing, Internet of Things, big data, we're also completely behind in a pro-innovation agenda, blockchain. So we have the EU Blockchain Observatory and Forum, which issues reports. It has a mapping of things that are going on, workshops which are open for anyone to attend. If any of you are in Europe, 24th of May on digital assets, another one coming up on blockchain in finance. It's run by Consensus Paris, so the Consensus that you know. They won in a public tender. It was a project that we're supporting. Then we have the European Blockchain Partnership, which is 29 countries, 27 EU member states, and Norway and Liechtenstein, that are already this year deploying a European blockchain services infrastructure, primarily in reg tech, in value-added tax reporting, customs excise reporting, also publication of audit documents, and probably a little further in the future, certification of diplomas across Europe, and self-sovereign identity on the blockchain, and for private and public transactions. Then also we're supporting, by being in its government advisory board, along with the OECD, the World Bank, the United Nations, the European Central Bank, and others, the International Association of Trusted Blockchain Applications, which is right now European, North American, and Japanese companies working at the regulatory dialogue. They'll have a World Blockchain Congress, 11th to the 13th of November in Malaga, which is seen as a regulatory dialogue opportunity. On the standards, which Greg mentioned, we are participating in International Standardization Organization's Technical Committee 307 on standards. It's happening at this level, and the Commission and OECD are both trying to influence the activities there in a positive direction for the blockchain community. And then perhaps lastly, but not at all least, we're preparing for our next, you could say, government, our next College of Commissioners. We have a new European Parliament coming and new politicians coming. I'm a civil servant, but we're preparing with the analysis of whether pro-innovation legal clarity would be needed in areas like smart contracts, recognizing them across borders, if you want them to be legally binding, of course. Also tokenization, looking also at the role of utility tokens in running especially decentralized systems. And if you want to use blockchain as an infrastructure layer, what you need to put into law or adapt into law on resilience, responsibility, liability.
Well, actually, we're just talking a lot about coordination and all these good initiatives going on, but I'm sure if we ask the crypto community, many would say, the level of coordination is not there where it could be and where people expect it to be. From your perspective, do you actually believe, is it possible that we're going to have real, genuine coordination between government bodies, policymakers, on topics like these? I mean, we're not able to agree on child labor or global warming. I mean, do you think it's something we can practically see? And maybe to frame it differently, on a scale to 1 to 10, where do you think we are right now when it comes to regulatory coordination on blockchain crypto? Maybe I'll start with you, Greg. 1 to 10, what grade would you give to policymakers today?
Ooh, that's, so I think you've got to distinguish, there's the work on AML and CDF that FATF is doing, where I think there's quite good coordination at the moment. On FATF. I think you can't sort of, I think it's difficult to judge overall. I think you've got to look at so AML, I think FATF, I think they're doing a good job, actually.
They get the good grade.
I think you give them a very good grade. I think on the area of securities tokens and ICOs, not so good. And as the former chairman of IOSCO, which securities regulators, I can probably, and I think, I know from having chaired that, it's always difficult to get consensus, but I think they are catching up. And I will actually say this is a really good example. I know when we discussed this at the board of the IOSCO about 3 or 4 years ago, I raised this topic of ICOs, and sort of the general conclusion, too small to really care. I think it's a couple of 100 million. But it's a good warning, because it just shows you that if you don't sometimes tackle something, or at least, I said my first point about being forward-looking and thinking about it, it might go from being too small to care to being too big to ignore. And I think what we saw in the subsequent 12 months is ICOs went boom, and then went, oh my God, what are we going to do? So, and I think there is playing catch up on that. So, and then I think more generally in terms of, blockchain, I think there is a need, where it's still very much baby steps in terms of regulatory architecture and thinking things about like interoperability and security, and I think this, and that's where, I mean, I've participated kindly in one of Peter's events, and the Commission has been doing some really good stuff and bringing together people participating. So it's early days, and I think, as I said, I think the initiatives we've taken as policymakers is to try and get on top of it, to try and guide people who are in the industry.
I'm going to come back to the FATF and the AML one, because I know it's a big topic today. Maybe I'll just move it to you quickly, Peter. From a European Commission perspective, obviously a lot of your member countries, whether Gibraltar, Luxembourg, Malta, have been very active in crypto. I mean, is that, do you believe where we are from 1 to 10 on the EU perspective when it comes to crypto collaboration, blockchain collaboration?
Well, I mean, I think if it was ever true, the stereotype that if it moves, Europe regulates it, was not at all the case this time. We've been aware and following and in some detail and also supporting research in the area of blockchain DLT for probably about 7 years. The idea came often and was proposed, have a regulation on blockchain. I mean, and we pushed back on that. We said we need to let the market develop. We have to see how much existing regulatory frameworks fit, and finally where, if there needs to be regulation at the European level, what we can learn from some experimentation at the member state level. So you have laws in France, which is a European Economic Area but not EU. Liechtenstein law now, you mentioned Malta. There are others. So I think now we're getting to a point where the next group of politicians that we will be working for as civil servants will be able to make a decision based on facts, on cost benefit, whether this will help innovation in this sector, in this community in Europe, because that's the idea. We're not trying to prohibit things. Fraud is already prohibited. It's a question of enforcement. Money laundering is prohibited. Crypto in various ways was added to the anti-money laundering directive. So I mean, on these things we were adapting the existing framework, but in terms of seeing if we can utilize tokenization, utilize smart contracts, decentralized systems, here we didn't want to rush in. Now it's coming to a time that there will be decisions on whether to act or not. Global coordination has already been going on for quite some time in the context of the OECD, G7, G20, we feed into that. I mentioned this International Association of Trusted Blockchain Applications, where we hope to have a regulatory dialogue on areas like finance, energy, supply chain, and others in November. So while it might be a little bit too optimistic to hope for, let's say, one global, identical legal framework, I would say it is too optimistic. I think there is a lot of coordination going on, and there's healthy competition between different approaches. I mean, this is what market economy is.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Actually, let's talk about competition for a second. I want to bring it back to AML in a second. There's obviously a lot of countries have taken different approaches, right? I mean, it's very interesting now. The beauty is the market economy. There's competition between jurisdictions as well. From all the ones you guys have seen, you know, what is the one country you think what the approach they've taken is actually quite innovative, and you think has a lot of potential, could be a good, interesting one for others to follow? Maybe I'll start with you, Patrice, and we're moving it back to Mark.
I mean, I should be hesitant to be pointing
I mean,
out
you love all
any
your children,
but no, I mean, I can say something that's very interesting to look at because it was based on what I like to see as an evidence-based approach of public consultation and looking to see what the inputs were. The French Loi Pacte, which was recently adopted, which has the application of the securities law to securities tokens, but those of which are not, which for most of our European jurisdiction is much more, which is a difference with the US jurisdictions. They have an opt-in framework that they're setting up. And then, of course, you can't miss, I mean, countries like Singapore, for instance, that also have a very, I think, pro-innovation and pro-business approach, while at the same time not allowing and expecting any fraud to be entertained in the jurisdiction.
It's interesting, France. I mean, what amazed me with the French, which is great, you're right, that you can file in English, which is a big deal for France.
As well.
So,
Yes.
So moving to you, Greg, if you have, you love all your children, but if there's one you think.
Well, actually, I must say, when you asked the question, I actually thought number one was the French.
There you go.
And I thought it was very innovative, and especially having worked for a French bank for 30 years, I know the French pretty well. And I was really impressed, to be honest, when I saw it, and it came out so quickly.
Yeah.
And I also do agree, the MAS in Singapore, but also the UK FCA are pretty innovative, and Australia at ASIC are pretty innovative. But I think the other one that's, if you want a little small economy, I think what the Bermudians came out with, a set of legislation, you know, got countries like that, you know, Mauritius. So there's a lot of, and they're nudging, or Malta, they're nudging the big players. So, you know, there's a bit of a international competition going on. But, you know, the thing about this, like at OECD, you know, for example, what we've done on base erosion of taxation, we have 150 countries as signatories to that, okay? Now, it started off, I don't know, maybe 40 countries, I can't remember, or 37 member. So what happens if you have a good global standard, it does grow. So my view is that, you know, the way you start these, you've got to start, right? You might start with 37. You know, the way you do this is like-minded countries go, yeah, we've got to come together on this. That's how you do it. It's not big bang. It evolves overnight, and that's how you do it. So I wouldn't despair on this stuff. Different people, but you do need, you've actually got to try and get a global approach on it, because otherwise it just becomes a real mess when you're trying to recognize one another, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about global. Let's talk about AML and FATF.
Let's talk about AML.
One thing people often don't know, the FATF kind of reports to the OECD. I mean, I don't want to get into politics of OECD, FATF, but...
No, sorry. It's a separate organisation with the secretariat that sits inside of the OECD. In fact, sits in my directorate. Yeah.
There you go. Fun fact for a lot of people. Actually, so let's talk about that. And obviously, there was a big meeting in Vienna. I think the general consensus, no pun intended, within the community is that we are more in favor of having proper KYC, AML, counterterrorism financing, because that's we believe the industry will become more institutionalized. The feedback often within the community is, for example, especially what happened in the Vienna last week in the consultation is, I mean, you're mentioning that we should make sure that we're looking at things with a new lens. Do you think the OECD and FATF are looking at crypto and blockchain using this new lens, not trying to make the horse faster, but trying to look at the engine and how we can actually use the engine for crypto?
And now, I don't want to speak on behalf of FATF.
No, of course, but I'm more
But I will say I have read some of the industry submissions this morning, and you know, clearly they've taken on, because they've taken on the fact that it exists, and you need to think about how it's regulated. But you know, at the end of the day, you've got to recognise that if you're going to try and challenge this, you can't say, well, this is technologically impossible, because if it is, they'll go, well, we'll just ban it. So it's pretty simple, really. I used to have a saying when I was a law enforcement agency, we could do this the easy way or the hard way. Or the hard way, in some countries, they have banned it, right? I think what you've got to do, if you're going to try and move the dial here, you've certainly got to engage. You need to engage at a global level on a coordinated basis for your industry. But equally, you know, what FATF, what anti-money laundering is about is you want to be able to follow the money. Okay, that's what law enforcement in this area is about, and you know, that is really what is driving them. And if it's not technically possible, then that's a problem.
But many will argue, and open it to you, Peter, as well. I mean, there's a lot of the technology we have today allows us to better follow the money than we have with traditional cash. And also from banning Bitcoin. I mean, we saw some of our Nobel Prizes here in the US mention that in recent days. I mean, technically, it's a bit difficult to do that as well, frankly, especially in an environment.
It's actually not that difficult. You can if they really wanted to.
Ban Bitcoin.
You could.
Okay. So I mean, that's a hardcore.
I'm not suggesting we do it, but I'm sure it could be done.
So, Peter, from your side perspective.
Sorry, in tracing money flows.
Yeah.
I mean, in law enforcement, one good thing about Bitcoin is actually it has been very helpful in law enforcement, right? Because you can actually trace it.
Correct. Yeah. And many would argue as well, I mean, I don't know what you think, Peter, but I think from a lot of you, compared to the traditional financial institutions, right? Many would argue that some of the large crypto exchanges today have better KYC, have better AML than a lot of the traditional banks were operating in the legacy systems.
There's unquestionably been a lot of issues with money laundering by no means, I mean, confined to the crypto space. I mean, we are having issues in Europe, and in fact, there's also prosecutions going on right now in relation to several of them. So, I mean, I tend to look at this on a little bit, I'd say, the positive side. What can we do with these technologies and regulatory tech, reg tech, to improve KYC, to improve the sharing of information, to enforce anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing there where it should be. And I mean, I think as probably everyone in this room knows, I mean, one of the beauties of blockchain technology is it can be applied to systems where you can't have a centralized database, but many different actors want to coordinate, and this can be an ideal technology for this type of decentralized coordination. So for instance, within the banks, sharing data between different jurisdictions on suspicious transactions. You add in the artificial intelligence and machine learning tools, which are developing rapidly by the day. And I mean, this can, I think, be a very serious help in the correct direction. And as well, I mean, we do know, many of us, the statistics that cash still plays in the money laundering and terrorist financing areas. So not absolving crypto of responsibility, and also making sure that in the future it doesn't become a black hole for money laundering and for terrorism financing. I mean, the technology is such, and I think the crypto community can also come forward and play an active role, because I mean, I think the killer app for crypto is not money laundering and terrorist financing. And if it was, it would not be a long-lived killer app.
So I must say, I completely agree. I think that's what we should be focusing on, is how you can innovate to solve the problem.
Yeah.
Actually, it's probably not much use saying, well, this is technically not possible to the regulators, because they'll go, well, it's your problem, not ours.
Yeah. Well, actually, on that point, Greg, I mean, obviously...
And I'm very pro, crypto
of course,
assets, so, but I'm trying to sort of be realistic.
Maybe one last question before we move to the final round. We have less than 5 minutes. Actually, from your perspective, right, obviously you're mentioning blockchain, a lot of the initiatives, the opportunities that it provides for various reasons that we know, but also on the crypto perspective. From your perspective, now that we're having more increasingly regulatory clarity on the broader space, do you believe we'll see financial institutions adopt crypto assets first, or rather blockchain technology on the way they operate, for example? Especially with your background in securitization at a French bank. I mean, what's your view on that?
Well, clearly the securitization industry has already done a very good paper 2 years ago on reimagining securitization in a blockchain world. And clearly with the long value chains in securitization, or even in infrastructure financing, which I used to oversee, we're looking at the OECD at the moment, has enormous potential to bring liquidity and transparency to both those sectors. Revolutionary, completely revolutionary. And I think you're going to see something probably in the infrastructure and or securitization space probably in the next couple of years. And that's quite exciting, actually.
No-brainer. So a lot of securitization. On your side, Peters, what do you think?
I mean, agreeing with that completely, and saying I think in the financial sector you'll see the technology, blockchain, DLT, continue to be adopted for many different uses. And then the area of tokenization, on the one hand, the securities, and then also we very much want to enable the utilization of utility or consumer or whatever you want to call them type of tokens for coordinating decentralized systems of peer-to-peer cooperation, whether economic or social. I mean, we'll see how big this does grow and how sustainable it is, but there's some really great business models out there. I mean, especially when it starts combining with what you can call the convergence of the other technologies, data from Internet of Things, from other sources, the management of data, and really realizing the full potential of artificial intelligence and machine learning.
I do think that's the key. These days, you've got to be thinking about solutions that combine IoT, AI, and DLT. Yep. And even now we're hearing about edge computing, right? Yeah. It's all about a solution. When you put the things together, it starts to look pretty exciting. I
always say it's not a 1 + 1 = 2 relationship, 1 + 1 = 3 relationship. So here we go. So guys, we have 2 minutes left. What I want to do, I want to finish up. My best friend, the Bell, is back with us. So what we're going to do is ask these other speakers some quick questions. I want 1 or 2, like 2, 3 word answers, quick. And if you go on for too long, I'll buzz you out. These are questions, I mean, you have no idea what we're going to ask. It'll be quick, and funny questions. Let's start with you, Greg, on this one. If you go back to university today, what is the one course you wish you had taken that when you were younger that you wish you had taken right now?
History.
History. That's interesting.
Because you learn so much from history.
Oh, here we go. Peters.
Mathematics, cryptography.
Oh, here we go. We'll start with you this one. Your nephew comes to you and tells you he has a couple of job offers. One is with a large bank, one is at a large startup, one is a Big 4 consulting firm, and one is with government and regulators. What job do you recommend he takes?
Startup.
Why is that?
The other thing I run is called Startup Europe, but I think it's an exciting opportunity to start your life and your career, and I was also doing things like that before I went into government and civil service.
Excellent. Greg?
Yeah, I'd say startup and go into asset management.
Wow, that's interesting. Why is that? Why asset management?
Because there's more and more money to manage.
Question for you, Greg. This is with your politician background. Donald Trump calls you and tells you he wants you to be his crypto advisor to make America a great crypto nation again. What is the one piece of advice you have for Donald Trump on crypto?
Sell your Bitcoin.
Sell your Bitcoin.
No, tokenize your real estate. How's
Here we
that?
go. That's the one. Here we go. Peter is.
Clear and sensible regulatory framework.
Okay, I'm sure you'll listen. Okay, we have 30 seconds. Tomorrow, if you're the CEO of a large legacy traditional bank, you're the CEO of a traditional bank, what is the one thing you would be? What is the one thing you would do?
I would basically stop being a bank, and I would actually rethink myself as a digital non-bank financial institution, because there's no future in banking.
Very good points. But you should tell that to your nephew as well, who's looking for a job. There you go.
Digital transformation from the point of view of the consumer, the user.
Awesome. Guys, that's all the time we have. Thank you very much. A big hand in the bench for our panel.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Here we go.